Good morning. This is Chair French convening the regular business meeting of the Kansas Corporation Commission for Tuesday, February 17th. I'm joined by my colleagues, Commissioner Keene and Commissioner Keither. On today's agenda, we just have a consent agenda consisting of 37 items, and then we do have one discussion item, which is our quarterly update on Southwest Power Pool activities by Justin Grady, our Director of Utilities. But we will begin with the consent agenda. Commissioners, you've had the opportunity to review those 37 items on the consent agenda. Let me ask at this time if you have any questions, beginning with Commissioner Keither
No questions, thanks.
and Commissioner Keene.
None for me either. I move approval of the consent agenda.
Second.
All right, we've got a motion and a second to approve the consent agenda. Is there any further discussion on that motion? Hearing none, all in favor, please vote aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed, say no. The consent agenda is approved. With that, we will move to our discussion item. And this, as I mentioned before, is a quarterly update on Southwest Power Pool activities. And our presenter for the item is Mr. Justin Grady, our Director of Utilities. And I believe, Justin, you've got your PowerPoint and we'll be sharing it from your computer. Is that right?
That is my intention.
Okay, we'll give you a moment.
Yeah, thank you. It's easy if you only have one screen, you know. All right. Can you see it yet?
Not yet. You're probably out of magenta ink. Nope, nobody will understand that that reference.
All right.
There you go.
That is an inside joke.
All right, we do see it, but it's not in full screen. It's on like the presenter mode.
Yeah.
And on mine, I had the flash of what appeared to be the carcass of a deer.
Oh, there's no way that's true.
Oh, I thought it was just absolutely inexplicable. Absolutely.
All right. Hold on. You know, I swear I did so much better last time. I had this ready to go.
When you go to share it, you should be under application window if you're full screen.
Yeah. What's it look like now?
Perfect. It's full screen.
All right, cool. Yeah, well, hey, good morning, everyone. Sorry for the technical difficulties this morning. Justin Grady, Director of the Utilities Division. Appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning to provide this update on first quarter 2026 SPP and FERC activities. I almost hesitate to say this, but I actually think this is going to be a relatively short update this quarter. But we'll see. I mean, I've got all the way until noon blocked off, so if we need to use the time, we certainly will. Okay, so the slides are advancing.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we've got your
All right,
agenda
great.
now.
So this is the agenda. As typical, you know, we'll talk about any items that have been approved by FERC or filed at FERC, you know, major notable items in the last quarter since we met last. And then we'll talk about the regional state committee business meeting and the board of directors meeting, which coincides with the members committee meeting. The RSC business meeting and board of directors meeting were at the first of the month in February. And so this is, you know, the first opportunity we all had to be able to get on the agenda and provide the update. In terms of a FERC update, this is a really good one. You probably recall we've had a lot of, you know, conversation over the years about HIT C1. That is the cost allocation policy that is just essentially directed at preventing the kinds of cost allocation inequities that we experienced in Western Kansas with the Sunflower Energy facilities that was fixed with the HIT C2 policy proposal, and that has been approved. It has been implemented. It's currently on appeal before the FERC, the DC Circuit Court. This policy was more of the sort of the proactive, forward-looking policy that applies to new transmission facilities that will be constructed, basically in the future. And but it only applies to highway or to byway facilities. So it only applies to facilities from 100 kV to 300 kV. And I know we've talked a lot about this, but this issue has a long sort of tortured history. It originally was approved in concept in 2019. Which, unfortunately does go to show you how long these kind of issues can hang around. A cost allocation issue. Cost allocation is amongst the most difficult issues to gain consensus on. Unsurprisingly, it's a zero-sum game, so to speak. Costs are being shifted from one area to the next, but ultimately this policy, in terms of affecting Kansans, what it will do is we will now cost allocate those sort of mid-level voltage facilities from 100 to 300 kV, instead of being cost allocated based a portion of them based on where they geographically reside, where the lines physically are, whether they're in your zone or not. Now they will be cost allocated across a broader region, across the sub-region. So for Kansas customers, the entire Kansas and Missouri portions of SPP will now pay for those costs. And that was originated, or that was decided because ultimately that's what the engineering and the transmission flows, the power flows supported, that basically that's the way the system is operating today and being dispatched today. If you'll recall that there's 5 subregions. Nebraska is its own subregion. Further north, South Dakota and North Dakota, and the portions of Wyoming and Minnesota and Iowa, those are a separate subregion. And then there's 2 separate subregions in the South, one for the Southwest and one for the Southeast. Last time we talked, this had been filed at FERC, which was a pretty big milestone. But it was actually approved on December 30th. It was a unanimous decision, and we were glad to see that be approved. Of course, the last bullet point notes that City Utilities of Springfield and the Louisiana Public Service Commission have both filed a petition for rehearing, which may be an indication that this is ultimately going to be appealed. We're hopeful that it will not be. But in any case, I really hope this is the last update I ever have to provide on HIT C1. That would be a really good thing for the state of Kansas, but I guess, that remains to be seen. On the electronic version of the deck that I sent, you can double click on that little order, and it'll open it up to the actual order issued by FERC. Okay, now moving on to the RSC business meeting on February 2nd. 3 relatively, uncontroversial moves or voting items that the RSC approved. The first was just the engagement of a CPA to perform an audit of the regional state committee's financials. That was passed unanimously. Also, as we sit here today, pretty much exactly at the 5-year anniversary of Winter Storm Uri, we actually February 17th was that Tuesday of that storm. If you recall, we didn't have load shed that day, but the price of natural gas and Southern Star Central Gas Pipeline was $622 an MCF. So that in any case, in the wake of Winter Storm Uri, the Improved Resource Availability Task Force, the IRATF, was established. This was, essentially the stakeholder group in which, at that time, all of the more consequential policy changes that were coming out of Winter Storm Uri were flowing through that task force. Sherry Albrecht, Commissioner Albrecht, former Commissioner Albrecht, was served on the IRATF at that time. We followed, the activities of that task force and participated in that process. And ultimately, what the membership had determined is that all of the goals that were set out in the IRATF either had been accomplished or were transferred to the REAL team, which is the Resource and Energy Adequacy Leadership Team. And so ultimately that task force was sunsetted. When you look back, 5 years in from Winter Storm Uri, and you think about the reforms that have been made. I mean, there really are pretty significant reforms that have occurred that were probably either directly as a result of Winter Storm Uri or indirectly. I think Winter Storm Uri exposed weaknesses in the system that that were always probably there, but we didn't realize until you could get that truly extreme, almost once in 100-year type of a winter storm to stress the system and really show us all what work needed to be done. So, in the wake of that, the planning reserve margin has been increased twice. We've established a new resource adequacy policy called performance-based accreditation, which basically looks at, for thermal units, it looks at precisely how are those units performing when they're called on, when they're needed the most. And then an adder on top of that, which is a fuel assurance standard, which says, okay, performance-based accreditation kind of evaluates year-round how much the performance of these units and how well they're performing. Fuel assurance looks at the top 3% net load hours and says, okay, so let's zoom in and see specifically how these thermal units are performing actually during an event like Winter Storm Uri or Elliott or otherwise. We've also implemented effective load carrying capability for renewable generation, which is pretty much the gold standard in terms of reliability and evaluating, precisely how it is that renewables or non-dispatchable generation is contributing to the reliability of the system during those loss of load events, during the times where the system is stressed the most. So, I mean, that's just sort of off the top of my head. There was an outage policy coordination methodology that was approved. There's a list of 19 or 20 specific reforms that have occurred in the wake of Winter Storm Uri, and I think the leadership or the stakeholder community had agreed that it was time to sunset that task force. And ultimately, that was a regional state committee decision, an RSC decision, because the RSC created that task force because of the resource adequacy authority that the RSC has. The third bullet point there, the RSC, you may recall we've talked about in previous quarterly meetings or quarterly updates that the regional state committee is going to evaluate cost allocation in 2026. That effort is occurring, I guess, alongside or parallel to the CARE initiative, the cost control and cost allocation review and evaluation team that I serve on for Kansas. There's not a lot of definition at this point in terms of how those, how the RSC cost allocation consultant is going to interact with the CARE, whether it will be that, the RSC cost allocation is an independent voice evaluating what comes out of the CARE or influencing the direction of that. There's to a certain extent. Some of it is sort of undefined at this point in terms of what their actual role is going to be. But first, the RSC had to get the consultant on board. And then there's, a scoping document is the next step, and that's what's going to be developed at this point. The other thing is there was discussion in the business meeting, the RSC business meeting, that there is not any hard and fast rule that this engagement can only last for 1 year. It is only a 1-year contract, but ultimately, I think, I mean, if that hits C1 example, I mean, hopefully it doesn't take nearly that long, but as an example, I mean, we've been dealing with that other cost allocation issue for 7 years, right? So it's not easy to make these kind of changes and these kind of policy policy changes, but in any case, it may very well be the case that Bates White is an RSC consultant for longer than just 1 year. Okay, and then the rest of the issues that we're going to discuss have their own specific slides, so we'll move on and get into the sort of the meat of the business meeting approvals. This first one, the loss of load expectation business practice changes. This was a non-controversial, I think very well supported policy approval at the Regional State Committee. So just for a little bit of background, loss of load expectation studies is how the Regional Transmission Organization establishes the required planning reserve margin. So LOLE studies, as they're referred to, are quantitative modeling exercises that evaluate on a probabilistic basis, right? They evaluate 43 years of weather data, actual, 8,760 hours a year weather data across the entire footprint. And it takes the system that we have today, the generation that we have, the transmission that we have, and the resources that we have. And it says, okay, if we were to have over the next 43 years, if our weather is exactly the same as the last 43 years, including Winter Storm Uri in those weather years, what is the likelihood that we in the region are going to be able to maintain reliability for firm load? In other words, what is the likelihood that the region will not be able to maintain reliability to serve all firm load, and ultimately the reliability standard that the system is planned to and always has been is 0.1 day of loss of load in 10 years. I'm sorry, 0.1 day of loss of load per year, or in other words, 1 day of loss of load in 10 years. And so the loss of load expectation study is where all of the nitty gritty modeling and engineering and planning analysis goes on to set the essentially to do the study to determine what the planning reserve margin should be. That's all the back end analytical work that supports the planning reserve margin. This business practice essentially just identified the key standards and assumptions that would be in every loss of load expectation study. And there's still an opportunity to change that. But I think the way it worked before is every year this was a brand new question, or when LOLE studies were performed, this was a brand new question that was put before the stakeholder community. And of course, unsurprisingly, there was significant difference of opinion on a lot of different sides of the issue, and it had the tendency to bog down the analysis and the process to establish the study parameters. What this said is, look, let's standardize as much of this as we can and put it in a business practice. That way, we all know going into the annual LOLE studies what we're gonna be evaluating and what the study's gonna look like. You can see there was a high degree of stakeholder consensus. The fact that MOPSI, Markets and Operations Policy Committee, passed this at a 100% approval is nearly unheard of. I mean, that does happen for, extremely administrative, ministerial type issues, but and the supply adequacy working group, there were a few dissenters, and you can see in the middle, that middle column there, describes what that level of dissent was about. This did pass the Regional State Committee unanimously. Okay, so the next policy was a little more substantive and a little less degree of consensus that was established. So this pertains to conditional high impact large load. Okay, so we're going to refer to that as CHILL, and CHILL is it is a non-firm or a conditional way to think of it as a conditional or a non-firm HIL, which is a high impact large load. So SPP recently did have its HIL policy and its HILGA policy, which is a high impact large load generation assessment. So essentially, if a data center or another high impact large load entity wants to bring generation to the table to serve itself, HIL and HILGA are the policies that allow that to be studied. The CHILL policy is complementary to the HIL and the HILGA policy in that it offers an opportunity for a short term, and by short term I mean 5 to 7 years path for while an entity is waiting for transmission service or for transmission investments to be completed in order to firm up their load, while an entity is waiting for maybe a permanent generation source that would come through the formal planning processes. This policy will allow those entities to take conditional or non-firm service, and this policy is one that did not pass around this time last year, and that's because it wasn't ready. The stakeholder community still had significant concerns. At one time this was established as something like an uncovered CHILL, to where you didn't have to bring generation to the table, and you would just sort of live off of available excess energy in the market. There were a lot of concerns about that, and so ultimately what passed is a much more defined, much narrower path, dual pathway for these conditional high impact large loads to connect to the system. And ultimately this did have a pretty high degree of consensus and support in the stakeholder community. And I think it's because of the improvements that have been made to the policy over the last 6 months or so, which have addressed sort of those reliability and economic concerns associated with serving these entities. One thing I'll note is that there is a transmission revenue billing component to this CHILL policy. So it's not a situation where, because these entities have conditional or non-firm service and they're not expected to be online during peaks, or when SPP sets 12 coincident peak rate design processes, that it's not that these entities are going to be able to avoid paying for the transmission system. They are going to pay essentially a point-to-point rate that's based on non-firm service, and it's going to be a reservation basis. So they're going to basically reserve space on the system and pay for it, and then ultimately, if they're curtailed, then they'll get credit for the times that they're curtailed. But this does have the potential to absorb a significant portion of transmission costs that ratepayers across the 14th state region are paying today. And so I think that's one of the reasons why people are excited about this policy. So as you can see there, those are all of the stakeholder groups that this policy went through. Quick acronym test for those listening online. This is the Markets and Operations Policy Committee, Operations Reliability Working Group, Cost Allocation Working Group, Regional Transmission Working Group, Supply Adequacy Working Group, Market Working Group, Transmission Working Group, and Economic Studies Working Group. So you can see that, you know, there was a pretty high degree of consensus approved as this went through. In terms of the regional state committee voting, there was only one state that voted no. That was North Dakota. And I think ultimately Commissioner Chrisman was concerned. I think ultimately he was concerned about the degree of abstentions that were recognized in some of these stakeholder groups. And he just thought that this might not be completely ready for prime time. Those are pretty much his concerns. This is just a quick sort of high-level overview of what the different paths are associated with this conditional high-impact large load. And I've got two more slides that drill down, you know, specifically into these different paths. But so the first one is this is a situation where a customer has already executed an attachment AQ agreement. So you cannot have an AQ study performed. Attachment AQ is essentially a load addition or delivery point change. So you cannot have a attachment AQ study performed unless you have enough designated network resources online to serve that customer for the next 10 years. Okay, and so this is a situation where you know, a utility or somebody else has enough generation resources to serve this entity, but there are transmission limitations that are recognized, local transmission issues. So this would allow that customer to go ahead and connect to the system today, but in the event that there are transmission limitations that would cause a reliability issue, then SPP is going to shut them off. Essentially, they're going to be they're going to be curtailed anytime that there's a transmission loading relief or local transmission issue. They're going to be curtailed. That's path one. Path two would be a situation where there is generation to support that high impact large load, but it's not exactly designated network resources, right? So designated network resources, it really mean, I mean, those are the sort of the gold standard of reliability resources. If you think about, you know, the combined cycle generation facilities that we approved last year, those will be designated network resources. If you take network integrated transmission service throughout SPP, you can add a DNR, you can add a generator anywhere within your footprint, anywhere that you have transmission facilities, and essentially those resources are deliverable to anywhere within your footprint. That's the way NITS service works. With path two, this is, you know, the entity that wants to connect is bringing generation, but it's not quite those, you know, gold standard of reliability resources that maintain firm transmission, firm delivery, and firm load service throughout the region. So this is a situation where you have a HILGA. Now, a HILGA, if you'll recall, is high impact large load generation assessment. This is a situation where a data center customer or another large high impact large load customer would bring generation with it to the table. But that generation is limited to the output of, like, the maximum output that's necessary to serve that specific load. So there isn't any guarantee or likelihood of delivery outside of that area. This is literally supposed to be generation that exists in order to serve that load. And essentially the idea here is that while you have generation, maybe there are not transmission issues, because at the end of the day, this is not firm load that the transmission system has been planned for. So you don't have transmission issues. And the idea is, as long as the generation that you brought to the system is online and there are no problems, no reliability issues associated with serving you, then you can be served. But as soon as you get to an EEA2, or if your generation is offline and there are reliability issues associated with that, then you're going to be curtailed. So 2 paths. First one, again, just a little more detail. Designated network resources, are providing that firm capability and deliverability, but for some reason there's a transmission issue, and you'd be curtailed for either an EEA2, which is just a wide area, loss of net generating capacity, or a local transmission issue. And then path 2, a little more specifics here in terms of what a HILGA is and what your time frame is. I mean, these are, by the way, these policies are limited. They're time frame limited. So, you can get a conditional high impact large load, but it only lasts 7 years. And I think, the idea there is that you don't want to have massive amounts of non-firm load for which you have not planned the generation system and the transmission system. The electric grid wasn't planned or designed for that kind of massive power to come online and come offline. It's just, this is basically a stopgap that will allow these critical loads to come online in the interim before, ultimately before transmission and generation is fully developed to support them. The last major substantive issue, the second to the last issue to come before the RSC was the update of the cost of new entry, the CONE. So CONE is used, cost of new entry is used to assess a required payment from a load serving entity that does not have the level of generation that it needs, that it's required to have in order to meet the requirements of the planning reserve margin. So, every load serving entity in the region is required to be able to serve its peak load plus 16% planning reserve margin in the summer of 2026. That is going to 17% in the summer of 2029. They're also required to have a winter planning reserve margin as well. If you do not meet those obligations, some people refer to this as a penalty. Some people refer to this as an assessment. It's essentially the stick, that SPP has to charge or assess a deficient load serving entity if that entity is not bringing the level of resources to the table that it needs to maintain the reliability of the region. This has sort of been a longstanding issue in terms of how outdated our cost of new entry had gotten. It was $89 a kilowatt year before. You can see it's almost doubling. I will tell you that of the entities, as you can see, there was a lot of consensus, but I think it was a recognition that we need to do something. This is almost doubling. But I think the other realization from the stakeholder community, and especially as expressed in the regional state committee meetings, is that this is still an outdated number. So this is essentially based on 2023 capital costs to construct a simple cycle CT natural gas facility. That is the latest data that was available by the Department of Energy when this number was put together. And so since that was a 2003 number, it was escalated at the general rate of inflation for over the last 2 years. As the three commissioners know, the cost to build a natural gas facility since 2023 has pretty much tripled, depending on what type of natural gas facility. I mean, maybe it's went from 275% to 325%, but it's certainly, it's growing at the rate of inflation isn't nearly enough, really. I think that's pretty well universally accepted. So there was an effort to approve this cone value and then immediately go into a more extensive evaluation of the process to establish this number and to update it more frequently. And that is a different revision request, which is revision request 749. And so that effort is underway and is going to be performed in the year 2026. So that's going to be a joint effort between the cost allocation working group and the supply adequacy working group. Just at a high level, something to think about here, $139 a kilowatt year. That's like $11 a kilowatt month. That's about half of the overall levelized revenue requirement of what we calculated the levelized revenue requirement was of those combined cycle gen facilities last year. Okay, so this number is still too low, in my opinion. It needs to come up. The other side of it is what you'll hear people say is, look, if we end up being short, then this number gets multiplied by 1.5 or 2 under SPP's methodology, right? You can't just charge people the cost of new entry, or people would always just ride on the market and just ultimately pay the cost of new entry. So anyway, there is a lot of back and forth that goes on in terms of the establishment of this value, but I think, at least from my perspective, it's still far too low. All right. So this is the last substantive issue that was on the RSC agenda. It did end up being quite a controversial issue amongst the membership. I'd say mostly the load serving entity membership, but also some of the public policy entities and the development community that was out there. Ultimately, this issue passed by a 10-2 vote by the regional state committee. I think, I think what the regional state committee would say, if you ask the individual commissioners, and many of them did make these points during the meeting, I think people thought, this policy isn't perfect, but it represents at least a year of intense work and collaboration. And I think we've gotten it to a place where it's workable. And if there's any tweaks or modifications that need to occur, we can continue to work on that as a stakeholder community. So this effort, I think, initially kicked off, I've heard up to 10 years ago, but it's just been so controversial that you couldn't ever get any individual stakeholder group to agree with the direction that it was going. So around this time last year, SPP formed a new stakeholder group. It was kind of a task force. It was called the cohort, demand response cohort. I served on that group, as well as a representative or two from Evergy, and there were significant Kansas focus or representation with this stakeholder process. But ultimately, what came out of that demand response cohort group, and then ultimately this was passed out of REAL, is a new demand response framework, which we'll go through in some detail, and also a peak demand assessment framework. I think almost universally, the stakeholder community was supportive of the demand response framework, but the peak demand assessment element is what gave people the most heartburn and thought that it was a step too far. And I think that's where the most significant consternation exists amongst the stakeholder community. We'll go into some more detail here. All right, I know this is a super busy chart. I put it in here sort of for reference purposes. I'm not going to read it all, but what it does is before this policy change, there was essentially market registered demand response. So you could put your demand response resource in the integrated marketplace. You could subject it to being dispatched by the market, but there was not a lot of that occurring. And I think that's mostly because it was mostly because it wasn't well defined in terms of, it was almost like an all or nothing. If you were going to put it in the marketplace, then you lost all control of how often it would be dispatched. There was a lot of additional work that needed to be done there. Or you could have a load modifying demand response. Now, load modifying demand response, I think you should think of it as, this is basically all of the utility sponsored demand response that you know of in the state of Kansas falls under this category today. So this is a situation where load responsible entities like Evergy or Sunflower or, Kansas Power Pool, they have control over these demand response resources, and they use them to manage their own individual peak, their non-coincident peak. And that is important because ultimately SPP sets your planning reserve margin requirements based on your non-coincident peak. So these are, there is a regional reliability component, but ultimately the load serving entities have a lot of control and visibility and autonomy, I guess, with regard to setting these programs up and managing them. SPP operations staff is one of the major drivers behind this policy change. SPP operations staff is getting increasingly concerned about the prevalence of load modifying demand response and or the potential growth of this resource type going forward. So today, because basically when you set your planning reserve margin, a load serving entity identifies what their peak load is, and then you take these load modifying demand response resources off of your peak load, and that is what you get assessed, basically what your requirement is, your planning reserve margin requirement. So if you think about, if there's a 60% planning reserve margin and you have 100 megawatts of demand response, well, that demand response is kind of worth 116 megawatts, right? Because you're avoiding not only that 100 megawatt peak, but also the planning reserve margin. The concern there by SPP's operations staff is if SPP Ops doesn't have a switch to use to deploy this stuff, they don't necessarily know what the degree of performance is of that load modifying demand response. They don't know whether it is performing in the fashion that it should, when it is, how long it can remain deployed. And those are all things that, as the region gets tighter and tighter and tighter on excess capacity over the next 2 to 3 years, really, before some of these generation resources can come online, that is something that really concerns the SPP operations staff. And so there was kind of a dual initiative here to broaden and expand the categories of demand response, like the left three columns, to broaden and expand the levels of demand response programs that could be offered, to really allow load serving entities in the region to customize what that demand response policy looks like, right? So if you look, just as an example, under the reliability registered EEA1, so that's a situation where you will not be called on if you're a local manufacturing facility and you have the ability to shut down for 6 hours during extreme reliability events, then this might be the category of demand response that works well for you. You get an hour of notification of lead time. There's only so many times that product is going to be called on, because EEA1s just don't happen that often. We've only had one actually since Winter Storm Uri, thankfully. And so there, what you see with all the details of the different categories is it's just an opportunity to really customize the type of offering that different demand response customers might prefer. And then ultimately, there is going to be a performance measurement and an accreditation process as well, right? So they're going to look back and say, specifically, how well are you actually performing if you are in one of the three categories: market registered, reliability registered, conservative ops, or reliability registered EEA1. For load modifying demand response, as you'll see, the way that SPP staff presented this is that, there's a lot of nones there, right? In other words, they really don't have visibility. There's not extensive SCADA or metering requirements today. Basically, the way that SPP staff, I think, got around to becoming comfortable with allowing load modifying demand response to continue in the fashion that it has or will is by saying, okay, load serving entities, you're setting up these programs. They were designed by you for your local needs and to allow you to shave your own local non-coincident peak. So we are going to hold you accountable for that. I mean, that's essentially what is going on. And so on the peak demand assessment, this is the provision of the policy that was the most controversial. In fact, I don't think a load serving entity, Empire District Electric Company, was the only entity that voted in support of this policy. And we'll get into why in a little bit. But the utilities were not happy about this by and large. So the framework that was approved by the RSC and by the board, what it will look like going forward is it will say, okay, we're going to set your planning reserve margin still, just like we always have. The SPP is going to set the planning reserve margin requirement based on your preseason qualified load, your weather normalized load, what you expect it to be, and your preseason qualified resources. And that's what your expectations are going to be to, like, if you've set your load forecast accurately, this is what your expectations are in terms of how much generation resource excess or margin you need. And then after the season, we're going to look at what your actual weather normalized load was with a 3% tolerance to account for risk outside of weather. And if your actual peak load was more than 3% essentially of what you told us it was going to be, then you are going to be assessed that payment, that required payment of CONE, the cost of new entry. And so today, let me just restate. Today, the way it works today, before this policy is applied, everything happens ahead of the season, and it's basically based on an assumed good faith load forecast. I mean, it just, you're a load responsible entity provides its load forecast to SPP ahead of time, and provides its list of accredited resources and says, okay, look, I have enough. I can meet my planning reserve margin, and you're good. And or if you don't have enough, then you are assessed this cost of new entry payment. And then nobody ever goes back and looks at, or there is study and analysis that's done, but nobody ever goes back and holds load serving entities responsible for what their actual peak load was, based on those predictions. And I think there's a sort of a I don't know about consensus or universally, but there is a large degree of consensus, at least amongst regulators, and I know SPP operations staff, of, look, this is a vulnerability in our system today. If we are setting the required amount of power plants or demand response or whatever based on what entities tell us their load is going to be, well, what if there are bad actors or just people that are really bad at forecasting what their load is? And yet, and this is presenting a vulnerability in the region that maybe we don't have as much excess capacity or as capacity as we thought. Maybe, we need to increase the planning reserve margin even more to account for that kind of variability. And so, yeah, ultimately, what passed was this, what's described on the screen here, which is that, you're going to set your load forecast in advance. It's going to be a 50-50 load forecast that's weather normalized. And then after the fact, we're going to evaluate how well did you do at setting that load forecast, and your actual load is going to be compared against your qualified resources and your accredited resources, and not your projected load. And I'm almost done because I see Chair French came off mute, but that is the element that I think is the most concerning by the load serving entities, is that there's just this uncertainty that now, we're going to be held to a higher standard than we've ever been held before in terms of, meeting our actual projected load. And I think the other thing is there's a concern that because of the uncertainty about whether or not, your actual load is going to come in where you projected it would be, that load serving entities would hold on to any excess capacity that they have at the beginning of the season, and that will cause, liquidity issues and unavailability of capacity to be traded across the region. Those are probably the arguments that stuck out the most to me. But ultimately, peak demand assessment, this did pass 10-2 at the regional state committee, and it passed the board of directors as well. So barring any, future changes or not being approved by FERC or otherwise, this will be the policy that load serving entities in the region will be held to after either 2027 or 2028. We'll get into that, but I'm going to take a break and see if there's any questions or comments.
Well, I'll add a comment while folks are thinking. I had quite a few things I wanted to say about why I ultimately voted in favor of this, but you kind of hit on everything there at the end. So I'll just reiterate it in a little less precise language. I mean, when I think about this, and I said this at the quarterly meetings, it really is. I don't know if it's shocking, but it is surprising when you think about it that this sort of policy has never existed in the past. Like Justin said, there's all this consternation about what people's planning reserve margins are and how much generation they have to carry. I mean, those are really big issues. But in the past, it's basically been the honor system. It's SPP asks the utilities to tell them what their peak load is going to be for the year, and that's the number. SPP doesn't independently calculate a number. The utility says what its peak load is going to be, and then you tack on the reserve margin, and then that's the amount of generation that the utility has to come up with. And you back out any load modifying demand response. You don't have to carry it for that. And again, that's just the honor system of them saying, here's what my peak load is going to be, and here's how much demand response I have. So I'm not going to carry reserves for that. And as long as on paper ahead of the season they have enough generation, there's no deficiency payment. Nobody ever, I mean, there can be a look back to see how that played out, but there's no formal process where anybody looks back and says who was good at that, who followed it, who didn't, was your load actually, 30% higher and you should have carried, hundreds of megawatts more generation. Nobody ever goes back and looks at that. And I want to be clear. I think from everything we've heard, most entities are actually doing a really good job. I think actually the honor system right now is generally working. People are doing a phenomenal job of projecting their peaks. They are. I haven't seen any evidence to suggest that entities, that there's any sort of systemic gaming of the system or people underrepresenting what their peaks are. Um, but I think Justin kind of hit on the impetus for this at the end, which is we don't have terribly robust demand response programs in SPP today. Large industrials that want to curtail. We've got at least one in Kansas that I know of. There may be some more load modifiers, but there's not a lot. But you're talking about tens or maybe 100 megawatts. But we're talking about bringing on large loads now that are going to be multiple hundreds of megawatts. And we're talking about data centers and some other advanced manufacturing. And a lot of them want to be flexible. They want to, and the utilities that serve them want them to be flexible so they can avoid building generation resources, at least in the short run. And so I think from SPP staff's perspective, from regulators' perspective, they see that a lot more people than current are going to want this ability to drop off the system, to be curtailed, as opposed to building generation to cover that, plus a reserve margin. And so as you can see all that coming, I think that is really what's driven the feeling that, yeah, the honor system might be a little dangerous. Now, when you're talking about adding gigawatts to the system that you're gonna hope are gonna, back off when peaks are when we're nearing our peaks, I think there was a feeling that there needs to be a guardrail. There needs to be a stronger incentive to make sure that those curtailments actually do exist in the way that they're being projected, and that just overall load forecasting is coming in as the same way that it's being put in workbooks. And again, I think as we talk to the stakeholders, even though they were generally, most were not in favor of this. Most do not want, it is a new requirement, a new potential for a deficiency payment. I mean, some would call it a penalty, but it's a deficiency payment. It's a new regulatory requirement they weren't subjected to before in the same way. But as we talk to all of them, I think Justin and I have really good confidence that this requirement to project your peak within 3% of a weather adjusted forecast, we expect that all of our folks will be able to do that. I think they can get a lot closer than 3%. I think they will. I think they're very good at this. But it is an element of something they're going to be held to now rather than the honor system. So, Justin, I don't have anything more than that. Just kind of want to reiterate, I think pretty much everything you just said.
Cool. No, yeah, thanks for the color. Give me a chance to catch my breath, drink the rest of my coffee.
You've been talking for a long time.
No, I mean, I guess one last thing, because you never know who's listening, in terms of other load serving entities out there or otherwise. So because this was as controversial as it was, there is an effort underway right now, I think, to maybe replace the peak demand assessment with something else, right? Maybe looking closer at the actual performance of load modifying demand response resources or otherwise. But as I talked to stakeholders a few weeks ago in Little Rock about where we stood on this issue, what what was really comforting to me, I mean, I'll just say what's comforting to me in you know, ahead of the load ramp that everybody thinks is going to happen. I mean, I think there's growing consensus in the region, right, that we're probably going to grow electricity demand by 30% in SPP between now and 2030, right? And that coincides with increasingly tighter and tighter actual reserve margin ahead of when some of the load serving entities in the region can get new generation built and online. And that makes me nervous as as part of a utility regulatory team that is ultimately responsible for reliability and affordability of energy in the state, state of Kansas. There's a very significant financial incentive for utilities and for the data center customers themselves to ramp up as fast as possible, right? You bring on a 500 or 600 megawatt data center with a 4-year load ramp. If you can ramp 200 megawatts faster 1 year ahead of time, well, that may be real competitive advantage for the data center developer. That may be real financial incentive for the utility to be able to keep that revenue between rate cases. I just think there's a lot of potential risk associated with setting the required reserve margin for the region based on hope, based on an honor system, and then never going back and looking to see
What happened?
whether those entities actually were held to those projections or not. And I mean, from my perspective, at least at this point, is that the one entity that's most capable of managing to its load projections is the load serving entity. They're the entity that is in charge of allowing the load ramp that comes in from the data centers. They're the entity that's responsible for flipping the switch on a load modifying demand response. And if they're not, and they're worried about being penalized because the load modifying demand response doesn't perform, then they need to rework the contracts to say, if we get a deficiency payment from SPP, we are charging that to you, right? So, I mean, that's just my personal views at this moment on the issue, and because I know that there's Kansas stakeholders out there actively working to develop an alternative to peak demand assessment. I just, I felt like for purposes of transparency that I should mention that. I mean, I'm personally comforted by this accountability aspect of peak demand assessment. And so anyway, I think it's going to be kind of a tough hill to climb to get over to where, there's some sort of brand new policy that completely replaces that. But anyway, that's probably enough, maybe even more than I should have said, but that's where I stand. Okay. And somehow, I caused the chair to put his mute back on. So, all right. So this is the motion. This is not the actual specific motion that passed. It was changed a little bit. But basically what passed is it's going to be implemented in 2028. The full implementation of this wrapped up policy, demand response, and peak demand assessment will go into effect in 2028. That was directly responsive to stakeholder concerns that were heard during the process that said 2027 is too fast to implement it. We need to rework contracts. We need to set up programs. We cannot implement this in 2027. So ultimately what passed out of supply adequacy working group and the real team was, okay, we're going to do a 2028 implementation. But in order to address the reliability concerns that the SPP staff had of waiting putting this accountability mechanism off, putting this enhanced accreditation, more detailed accreditation framework off 1 year. In order to get there, SPP staff said, okay, that's fine, but we're going to cap the level of demand response, new demand response that can come in at 2,152 megawatts for the summer of 2027. And that was based on what load serving entities told SPP would be in demand response for 2027 last year. So they were saying, okay, fine, we're going to sort of stop the bleeding. We're not going to allow any more of this stuff until we get the full accountability framework implemented. What we came up with sort of on the fly at the RSC meeting was a slight modification of that. And it essentially was, if you are ready, if you're a load serving entity and you are ready for 2027 implementation, then that cap will not apply to you. So it just introduces a little bit more optionality, and ultimately, I think that was responsible for gaining some consensus. There were specific stakeholders that were opining that they would prefer to have at least the optionality to implement this policy faster in order to bring demand response on if they were ready to do that. And so that's ultimately what passed. All right, now we're moving on to the board of directors meeting. Basically, everything that we've already discussed that came through the RSC the next day goes to the board, and all of that was approved. The next issue that and actually the last substantive issue that I have to address this morning is the short-term reliability projects selection that occurred at the board of directors meeting. So short-term reliability projects, if you're not aware, okay, FERC requires, in FERC Order 1000, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission said to every planning region and regional transmission organization, every transmission entity essentially in the country, said, you have to remove federal right of first refusal from your transmission tariff. Basically, before FERC Order 1000, if a transmission line terminated at two utility-owned substations, then both utilities got 50% ownership right to build the transmission. That's the way it worked. The federal government said, no, we're not doing that anymore. You have to remove the right of first refusal. We're going to pursue competition in terms of transmission ownership. And the commission will recall that the Wolf Creek to Blackberry line is an example of a competitively bid and built transmission project directly as a result of FERC Order 1000. But in that FERC Order 1000, what FERC said is you don't have to do competitive bidding for your transmission projects for one of basically three reasons. One, if there is a state law that prohibits competition, FERC said we are not going to exercise jurisdiction over this or take up, this litigation over basically states' rights. If a state says there is no competition in our state, then we're going to abide by that for now, basically. The second reason was if a project has a reliability need by date within 3 years, if it's a short-term reliability project, you don't have to do competition. And then the third reason is if it's a rebuild of an existing transmission facility, like maybe a reconductoring or an upgrade, or in some form or fashion, the project would rely on a right-of-way or an easement agreement that a current utility has, then you don't have to do competition. That was basically saying, the federal government isn't going to come in and tell an existing utility what it can do with its existing assets. So this is a requirement in SPP's attachment Y of the open access transmission tariff, which is the transmission owner selection process, which is the competitive process for FERC Order 1000. This is just a little bit more detail, but it basically says, look, if the independent board of directors of SPP makes the decision that these projects are needed within 3 years, then they don't have to be subjected to competition. And the staff of the SPP puts them in a short-term reliability project report that goes before the board. The board has the discretion to accept or deny that report, and ultimately they make the decision. The recommendation in this case was for these 4 transmission lines to be identified as short-term reliability projects. Now, these are all out of the 2025 ITP. You'll recall last quarter we talked about the ITP. This is the one that started off as, calling for about $18 billion of transmission. Ultimately, what came out was about $8.6 billion. And these 4 lines, I have a slide in the deck, these 4 lines account for about half of that. So about half of that is going to be subjected to competitive process to determine who's going to build the lines. And the other half is going to be built by the incumbent utility. There was a alternative motion that was made by their elements of the SPP board that want every 765 kV line to be competitively bid. There were stakeholder comments filed from lots of different places in the region that called for something similar. Ultimately, that motion failed. It couldn't get enough support for the SPP board. So I'm going to point out a few of these lines: this Crawfish Draw to Phantom 765 kV and the Seminole to Southwest Shreveport 765 kV line. You'll recall, this is a graphical representation, or a map, geographical representation of the 765 kV lines that came out of the 2025 ITP. The 2 lines that they have determined will be competitively bid it's right here from, oh, that's right, you can't see my pointer. It's right here from Crawfish Draw to Phantom, and also this Seminole to Southwest Shreveport line. Now, you'll recall, these 2 legs of the 765 kV system were the most critical assets that SPP staff was telling the stakeholders, we literally cannot meet our NERC requirements, our NERC obligations to maintain reliability of the system if we do not build these transmission lines. And ultimately, I think there was a very high consensus amongst the membership that probably was the best way to address the reliability issues that were occurring there. Both of these areas of the system, you'll also recall, experienced firm load shed last year as a result of infrastructure weaknesses in the area. There was not enough transmission in the area to support the load that exists sort of on those outer edges of the system. Interestingly enough, this Crawfish Draw to Woodward, well, that was also a reliability line, right? It just wasn't the level of severity of it. We have to have this within 3 years. So it didn't meet the definition of a short-term reliability project, and neither did the Seminole to Anthem 765 kV line. So, I think this was sort of misreported and misinterpreted by some stakeholders in the region as, well, there's not going to be any competition again for any transmission that came out of the ITP. But actually, this will probably be the most competitively bid group of notices to construct that's ever come out of an ITP. Because, about half of the total projects are ultimately going to be competitively bid, at least based on this short-term reliability project. And what you can see is, the other 2 major 765 kV lines are going to go through a competitive bid process later this year. That is the that's the end of the prepared slides. I did put some slides in the appendix that that discuss the care team, the cost control and cost allocation review and evaluation team that I'm serving on, and what they're looking at, what that work plan looks like, and we certainly take some time to talk about those if it's desired, if there's any questions, and then sort of just a few additional slides that talk about the direction of the 2026 integrated transmission plan, which is probably going to evaluate a full 765 kV overlay for the entire region, and what the next steps are there and what that process is going to look like. So we can go there, or we can go to Q&A. I can take down the slides. I'm at your disposal for at least the next 45 minutes and probably more.
Justin, while the other two commissioners are thinking of questions, I think I'd just offer one comment on the short-term reliability projects and the decision on whether they'd be competitively bid or not. I mean, I agree with the comment you had there at the end, that this will be, this is an expansion of competition, relative to previous portfolios. I mean, certainly in the past, it was one or two lines out of a portfolio, and they weren't this magnitude. The flip side of that is, I will say I personally was a little surprised that the choice not to bid out some of these lines, just given the magnitude of cost. But I'll also say that there are competing reasons on both sides of that. The board got a lot of feedback from both sides during their meeting, and probably outside their meeting as well. They were hearing from a lot of stakeholders. I think the thing I'd want to address is, I know some people are happy about the decision, some people are disappointed. We've had people question, why didn't we stand up in the meeting and lobby the board one way or the other. First I'd point out we don't have a vote. That decision on short-term reliability projects, that's a decision for the independent board of directors. Not even the utilities get a vote on that. It's the board. But I would say we have had a lot of conversations. I mean, we've talked to all the stakeholders about this issue. I personally spoke to a lot of SPP staff members, personally spoke to board members, and I can tell you that we debated the issue. I definitely made sure they understood what the stakeholder sentiment was on both sides in the state of Kansas. The feedback we had been getting from particularly legislators and policymakers. So while I didn't think it was necessarily appropriate for us to stand up in a formal board meeting and lobby them one way or the other on this issue, it just seems a little outside of the realm of our place. We certainly made them aware of what the debate is in Kansas, and so that was, that. I think some people would like us to pick sides, would like us to be, stronger on this issue. I'm just going to say it's a difficult issue. There are reasons on both sides, but we definitely let them know, both the SPP staff and the board, where sort of the Kansas stakeholder community was. They got the full range of that feedback. So, Justin, I don't know if you had anything to add to sort of that comment and what our advocacy was, but it was a little different. I mean, at the previous quarterly board meeting, as everybody knows, we got up and we made a lot of comments about the portfolio and the direction we'd like to see. But this one was a little different. This one was a little more of a call for the board. But we did make sure they understood where the state of Kansas was, in our conversations with them. So again, if you have anything to add to that, Justin, but I thought I would address that.
No, I think that covers it.
If I could, Justin, on this topic, let's pursue this a little more thoroughly here. I think it's probably an understatement that I share significant concerns about those instances where there is no competitive bidding. I got a lot of problems with that. So if we go back to the the short-term reliability projects as determined by SPP. What I understand you to be saying is that basically the determining body within SPP is the board. The board within SPP determines which projects fall within the ambit of that 3-year reliability assessment or necessity, thereby precluding the need for competitive bidding. Am I right on that?
Yeah, that's accurate. At least according to, the established process that's in their tariff that's been approved by FERC. But if there is a state, if a state law precludes competition, then SPP, their tariff does not allow, that FERC has not taken the step of overriding existing state law in that regard. So, and I don't have a list of every state that has a right of first refusal in front of me, but there are a significant number of states in the region that specifically do not allow competition, right? So the board's hands are sort of tied in that regard. But you're right. With the short-term reliability projects, the tariff requires the staff to make an engineering assessment and provide a report and a recommendation, but the board has the discretion to approve or deny that list. And that is, that's where the authority stands right now.
All right. So as best you could divine it, what factors bear on any decision by the board to determine that the 3-year reliability need is in play?
Yeah, so I'll do my best. I mean, I will say that this issue, this one specific vote in this one issue, I would say it took up at least 2 hours of detailed debate at the board meeting, but it could have been more. But it's definitely amongst the most controversial, contested, contentious issues that there are. You got half the people in the room, or a good portion of them, represent competitive transmission developers, or many times renewable energy developers who want to see competition for these lines. You also have transmission dependent utilities, people like municipals and cooperatives. Well, not always cooperatives, but municipals. They want to see competition for these lines. And they argue, they say competition saves customers money. It allows these projects to come online faster than would otherwise be the case. It allows real world, defined cost caps with contractual provisions that can be called upon. And they point to projects like the Wolf Creek to Blackberry line, in which there was real cost savings associated with that going to customers. People on the other side of that debate will say, okay, actually, there was $40 million of cost overruns that are not being recovered from customers on that line. And that's really just a loss leader in order to allow a foothold in the state and to be able to, pursue additional renewable energy on those transmission lines. So that's not real cost savings. It's going to show up other places. They'll say doing a competitive bid process adds 1 year to the process, right? These are short-term reliability projects that were needed yesterday. We had real load shed last year in our area. We had to shut people off in May. Let me build these lines. I'll do it faster. I'll work with the landowners better in my area. Actually, Oklahoma Corporation Commissioner Kim David spoke up in support of allowing local utilities to build these lines. They said, we have siting authority now in the state of Oklahoma. I want to work with utilities that I know that are going to be more flexible and responsive to my landowners. I don't want to have to introduce my landowners to a brand new utility that's never built anything in my state before. Let me deal with this, in the local fashion that we want to. I mean, the arguments really boil down to familiarity of the entity that's building the line and how flexible that entity is going to be with local landowners versus, and how quickly they can get the line built versus the other side of it is an economics issue, right? We've seen that competitively bid lines come in lower priced than non-competitively bid lines. And I mean, that's as good of a job as I can do is presenting both sides of the issue, but it is a highly contentious issue with, some of the most talented people in a 14-state region in a room of 300 people debating it for over 2 hours.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I'd add, Justin, you did a wonderful job of giving the two sides. I mean, I think Justin and I tend to lean a little toward the competition side because we've seen the track record on recent projects in the region and in the state, and we see the economic benefits associated with that. But that's not, there is the other side, which are some of the more intangible benefits of having a local company work with landowners that know it. And I mean, I'll just say there are competing studies out there from large reputable consulting firms, and both sides of this issue have their own study. And both studies say, one study says competition actually drives up costs and delays projects. The other study says, it points out, the lower costs associated with competitive projects. And, I haven't spent hours upon hours reviewing those. I suspect they've each kind of cherry picked projects from different parts of the country to fit a narrative. I think Justin and I would say from what we've seen so far in SPP, competition has not necessarily slowed things down too much, other than maybe the competitive process itself. And we have seen the economic benefits, but to be fair, there haven't been that many lines yet. I mean, we're talking single digit lines. So, Justin laid out really well, the two sides of the issue. And I mean, I just would say, yeah, there's definitely evidence on both sides that people could rely on to say, that one or the other is in the public interest of our region.
Well, I appreciate you're both weighing on the question. I'm going to pursue a couple of the things that you addressed there. Yeah, I guess it's pretty obvious which side I come down on. It may be the minority side. It isn't really making a difference to me. I think competition is significantly important. We're talking about huge capital outlays. We're talking about infrastructure changes that influence the lives of the people that are affected by it, that the ratepayers who are going to pay into it. I'm concerned about a whole host of issues here. But Justin, going back to your point here, just so I'm maybe somewhat factually correct here, you actually anticipated a further question of mine by noting the fact that competitive bidding and the benefits of competitive bidding are borne out by the processes within the Wolf Creek to Blackberry line. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I don't.
Just a point of fact.
It's just,
Please.
That Wolf Creek to Blackberry line is one that, we've pointed to in legislative testimony. And I know there was a press release when that line was energized earlier this year that was talking about, I mean, it was like, I don't know, I think it was like 30 or 40% below the study cost estimate at the time. And there were, those cost caps have held up, the protocols have held up, but what the other side will say is that line was as controversial as it was to cite because they literally did a straight line from one substation to the next. And, incumbent utilities that are not under the gun of that kind of competitive pressure have an opportunity to be a little more flexible. Maybe, don't have to go straight across the countryside. It's those kind of arguments. That's what people talk about, right? Is how quickly can you build something and how cheaply can you build it versus how well can you build it and how much flexibility do you have? That's a big part of it.
I think that's a fair answer. I appreciate that as well. Seems like to me within the ITP planning process, somehow that could be adjusted to anticipate the additional 1 year to which Chair French alluded in the timeline that may be impacted by doing competitive bidding. I'm not trying to suck our conversation here into the midst of all the pros and cons about that this morning. Trust me. Back to another point that you made, clarity for me. With all due respects to Chair David in Oklahoma, and her belief that it have to be benefits associated with dealing with established utilities who have a track record and a historical legacy within a given territory or state. I get that, but on the other hand, isn't Oklahoma a ROFR state?
They
Am I wrong about that?
They have a right of first refusal for everything below 345 kV.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
anything.
All right,
So
thanks.
yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. And Oklahoma, I mean, each state is its own domain to me. All the circumstances in Oklahoma, it's sometimes easy to analogize, sometimes not so much, because there are sometimes distinctions with differences, and in other instances, distinctions where the differences are less pronounced. I get all that too. Let's go back, kind of a holistic view of your presentation today, which I'm always grateful for. I thank you so much for the granularity of the information that you provide to us, and I think it's always helpful. Let's go back to another issue that really concerns me a lot, and that's cost allocation. It concerns all of us, not unique just to me, for sure. You touched on cost allocation within a SPP domain and within several different contexts, as I understood your presentation today. Just kind of brief us and me in kind of a holistic sense about what you anticipate SPP is going to do insofar as what I believe I understood to be their commitment in 2026 to take a look at cost allocation and some of the fairness issues associated with that subject.
Yeah, sure. Let me just quickly, I'm not going to read these slides to you, but I'm just pointing these out in terms of what's in the appendix. So there's sort of parallel efforts that are occurring in 2026. Okay, so there's the care team, which we've discussed prior. The care team area of focus it's really fairly narrowly defined in terms of, it's 4 or 5 issues, but they're like giant issues that are going to affect every ratepayer in a 14 state area. So it's not gathering consensus is obviously not going to be easy, but this is a list of, the membership that is on the care team. And then these are the areas that we've already covered in December and January and also February. And this is a pretty good sense, I think, of, what we evaluated in February is sort of a pretty good sense of what this may look like going forward in the coming months. Okay, so first of all, with regard to we evaluated in detail. We had presenters come in from MISO and PJM to talk to us about their cost allocation methodologies. And of course, there isn't anything that requires or limits the scope of what the care team does to what is existing within these other methodologies, but it's important to remember that whatever we come up with, FERC has to approve. The legal standard is roughly commensurate and just and reasonable. And if our other cost allocation initiatives have proven anything, it's likely to be that probably no matter what we come up with, somebody is going to contest, somebody is probably going to appeal, and it ultimately will have to be upheld by that standard, right? So those are really interesting presentations, but MISO and PJM, I mean, what I will say is that both of those entities has a much more granular, much more detailed, much more complex, and much more analytical cost allocation framework than SPP does, right? I mean, I don't have a lot of the specifics right off the top of my head. I probably could have, pulled those in. We could do another hour-long update, sharing that information. But basically, I'm gonna summarize this as saying that MISO and PJM either track the economic benefits associated with their lines or the reliability benefits associated with their lines for most of their projects, and they cost allocated in that fashion. Now, the really big stuff that MISO is developing right now, which, SPP is not the only region that's developing 765 kV transmission, right? MISO is doing it, ERCOT is doing it, PJM is doing it, and there's a major initiative across the West. The big 765 kV lines that MISO is developing are allocated very similar to highway byway in that they are spread load ratio share throughout the region, but they are not spread based on 12 CP, right? Based on 12 coincident peaks of how you have used, right now, just quick reminders. Right now, Kansas gets allocated. If we make no changes to highway byway, Kansas would get allocated around 16.5% of any 765 kV line that is built anywhere in the region. And that 16.5% represents the average amount of usage of all the Kansas utilities in the region, or all Kansas utilities, relative to the average usage of everybody else in the region on the peak hour of 12 separate months over the last year, right? So it's a 12 coincident peak allocation. It's purely what's your relative demand compared to everybody else's. Those MISO projects are cost allocated based on annual energy usage, which is different. Instead of a demand-based allocation, it's an energy-based allocation. And there's two separate areas of MISO. There's MISO North and MISO South. They do a transmission plan for the North, they do a transmission plan for the South, and they cost allocated in that fashion. But a lot of the other projects that they do are much more allocated. If it's a reliability project, it's cost allocated to the entity for whom the reliability issue is being solved. So I go through that to say that there is one of the efforts that's going to be evaluated in this care team is whether we should switch to something more granular, more analytical, more specific, more complex. And I actually threw out, I'll just tell you, I kind of threw out a straw man at the end of the last care team meeting, which said, why don't we evaluate allocating transmission 50% based on the economic benefits that are projected over the next 10 years, and 50% based on the reliability improvements associated with these lines in terms of thermal and voltage issues resolved. And maybe once we define the allocation to the states, then maybe the billing determinants, the rate design, should be half based on 12 CP and half based on annual energy usage. And with annual energy usage, what we would pick up is some of those higher load factor customers that use energy all the time, right? Not just 12 hours of the year, which is what the allocation is based on today. So, those are the types of issues that we're really going to be diving into in March and in April. The other issue, so that would be covered under alternative cost allocation methods, right? The RCAR Lite, what you see, Regional Cost Allocation Review Lite, what that refers to is, every 6 years, SPP does a regional cost allocation review, and that is a deep dive analytical framework to evaluate how each state and each zone in the region is benefiting from transmission. They literally go in, they rerun the integrated marketplace by taking transmission lines out of service. So this is not theoretical stuff, right? You can calculate the benefit of a transmission line. But then where the consternation comes in, or the contentiousness is, the contention comes in is, you got a real benefit of a transmission line. How long do you assume that benefit is going to exist? Is it 10 years in the future, 20 years, 40 years, 50 years? So it's all of those nuances around that. But in any case, one of the things we talked about in our kickoff meeting was maybe we should essentially do a regional cost allocation review type analysis for all of the 765 kV lines at once. And that crosses 3 separate ITPs, right? There was 765 in the 2024 ITP, 2025, and 2026. And say, let's take all of those lines, let's run them through the best engineering modeling framework that we have, and say, how are the different regions and the states in the region going to benefit? And then maybe we cost allocate the 765 in a fashion that is different based on that result. Maybe it's only different for 10 or 15 years. And then after that, nobody knows what 15 years from now is going to look like. We go back to some sort of energy-based allocation throughout the region, something like MISO is doing today. So, and then one last thing is the large load allocation policy, right? So there is a definite understanding that at least 30%, say, of the drivers of these transmission projects is the anticipated growth in load from very large users of electricity, data centers specifically. And I think there's a question of, look, a lot of work has been done, good work has been done at the retail level, at the state level, for protecting captive customers, existing customers from cost allocation shifts or stranded asset cost risk associated with these large load customers. I did a presentation in our January meeting about the large load power service tariff that we approved in Kansas. And there's been a lot of question about maybe we need something like that at the wholesale level as well. Maybe we need to require these large customers to take service for 12 or 15 years, and they need to have minimum bills and minimum billing determinants that say, if your business plan changes significantly in 4 years, you're still going to pay your allocated portion or your allocated share of these transmission costs. And, and ultimately it's up to the load serving entity or the utility to collect that from you. So I know that's pretty high level, but that's, there's been a lot of brainstorming, a lot of, evaluation of what the potential options are. And that's the work that's been done in the first 3 meetings. And going forward, we're moving into the detailed analytical phase now of actually proposing solutions and coming up with straw man proposals. And yeah, so that's kind of where it's at. This work plan timeline, I think, gives you a pretty high level of, benchmarks of the expectations are as 2026 on. And that's all only CARE. The RSC and what the RSC is going to do, I think the RSC is probably going to respond and be involved in the CARE team initiative. But ultimately, whatever CARE comes up with will only be advisory. It will be a recommendation to the regional state committee, because that's where the actual authority lies on cost allocation is within the regional state committee.
That's very helpful. I appreciate, that's a lot of granularity. I loved all of it. Thank you for doing that and taking the time to kind of walk me through that. I have one more question, and then my questions are finished. If we could go back to close to the end of your slide presentations there, and where you identified some of the, I think these 765 lines that are going to be competitively bid, basically Oklahoma to Texas to the couple of legs there into New Mexico. These lines, I take notices to construct have been issued with respect to these lines, have they not?
You know, I don't think so. It's kind of complicated. It has been approved by the board. The board has approved the issuance of NTCs. Then the next step is they've got to determine who the owner is going to be. Now that the short-term reliability projects have been identified, the next step is that SPP will issue notices to construct with conditions. And there is sort of a refinement that goes on to make sure that the costs are, the study cost estimates are accurate. But the answer is I don't think NTCs have been issued yet, but they will be very soon. For the non-competitively bid projects, right? But the competitively bid projects are these, right? So the one from Crawfish Draw to Woodward is going to be competitive. The one from Seminole to Anthem is going to be competitive. But these two legs going down in the southwest and southeast corner of the footprint are the ones that will be built by the incumbent.
Okay, that's helpful. So my follow-up to that is that as things now stand, in all probability, the NTC is going to be issued, I take it, within the next few months. It's a near-term event. As things stand now, that Kansans are going to be bearing roughly 16.5% of the cost. However that ultimate cost is derived through competitive bidding or otherwise.
So that is based on today's cost allocation. That's true. And one of the things that at some point, probably pretty soon, we're going to need to address both as an RSC and as the care team is whether or not the new cost allocation methodology that we identify, if we identify one, will apply to only NTCs that are issued in the future, or whether it will apply to project costs that are incurred in the future, or whether it just says at any point in time for any project that comes into service, right? This is the new cost allocation regime. There is no prohibition. Retroactive rate making, the non-lawyer director of utilities is telling you that there is no retroactive rate making will not apply as long as the cost allocation applies to the rates that are charged the day after the cost allocation is approved. Retroactive rate making doesn't care when a notice to construct was issued or when construction was occurring, right? It's all about, as long as you set rates on a prospective basis, we could change cost allocation at any time for any one of these projects.
Yeah, Justin, I would just to clarify, just and remind people, there was the HIT C2 initiative, and that's one where, midstream for a set of projects in Kansas, they decided to change the cost allocation, and FERC approved that. And it's not retroactive rate making because it's just applying to the amount of revenue requirement, moving forward, or the amount of amount to be recovered moving forward, or they're not going back and rebilling. And so, as you look at these projects, I mean, these are these are not going to be, they've not even begun to build these things. So we're talking about years from now when they start to be billed to customers. So there's, if there's some decision made on cost allocation and stakeholders in the board or the RSC and the board decide that they'd like to create a cost allocation for projects that have NTCs today, if that's put in place 2 years from now, I mean, these projects won't be billed probably even 2 years from now. So I don't think that there may be reasons why people don't want to apply a new cost allocation to these lines, but from my perspective, I've not heard any legal reason why a new cost allocation could not apply to them.
Okay, thanks. Thanks to both of you. That's the end of my questions for today.
Thanks for asking the questions on the care team also. I kind of wasn't sure whether I should specifically go into those slides and talk about that or not, but I'm glad we got a chance to.
Well, thank you, Justin.
I am
We
too.
always-
Granularity. Pardon me. Pardon me,
Oh,
Chair
and-
French. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, we always appreciate the update, and whatever time Justin allots to us, we're going to use it. So, well, we have reached the conclusion, I believe, of that discussion item, which also brings us to the conclusion of all the items on our business meeting agenda. And so at this time, reaching that conclusion, I will ask for a motion to adjourn the business meeting.
I move that we adjourn.
Second.
All right, we've got a motion and a second to adjourn. All in favor, please vote aye.
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 Aye, we're adjourned. Thank you all. Take care. Thank you,
Thank you.
Justin.
Thank you, Justin.